Hi, everyone. This is going to be a continuation of our series of famous quotes about Paul. This will be episode 19, part 1. It's on Ferdinand Christian Baur. His particular quotes will be mostly coming from this work here to the right, The Church History of the First Three Centuries by Dr. Ferdinand Christian Baur. This was written in 1853 and published in the United States in the 1870s. This is his biography. He was born in 1792, died in 1860, German Protestant theologian and leader of the New Tübingen School of Theology, named for the University of Tübingen, where Baur studied and taught. Following Hegel's theory of dialectic, Baur argued that second-century Christianity represented the synthesis of two opposing theses: Jewish Christianity, Petrine Christianity, and Gentile Christianity, Pauline Christianity. I don't know why Wikipedia threw in there about Hegel's theory. That has nothing to do with anything about Baur's talking about this. Is how maybe other people tried to explain it. But what he's really doing is he's just looking at our earliest church history and realizes there was a great divide between the church that was following the 12 and the church that was following Paul. Jewish Christianity versus Pauline Christianity. This and the rest of Baur's work has had a profound impact upon higher criticism of biblical and related texts. So what that means is Baur puts weight or relative weight on things that you can see in history, and you then critically examine them separate and apart from other things to evaluate them without looking through our hindsight. So we tend to look through lenses of how it is today, and then we look back and we obscure what was originally there. So his critical analysis to say, hey, wait, let's just look at the Christianity of the 12 apostles, then let's look at the Christianity of Paul, and then make a determination, are these the same religions? And what his well-known conclusion was is that they were what we see today is a synthesis of two different religions made to look like one. All right, so let's begin. This is one of the first quotes. What kind of authority can there be for an apostle who, unlike the other apostles, had never been prepared for the apostolic office in Jesus' own school, but had only later dared to claim the apostolic office on the basis of his own authority? So he asks challenging questions. He asks hard questions. Now I want to read to you from page 50 of that book. The only question comes to be how the Apostle Paul appears in his epistles to be so indifferent to the historical facts of the life of Jesus. He never mentions anything. He mentions that Jesus was born of a seed of David. That's all he says. He doesn't say how he was born or any of that type of issue. Doesn't talk about any of Jesus' teachings. Doesn't quote any of them. He does quote the Last Supper, but that's just a formality, something that was going on apparently regularly. So where what happened? So that's what he's asking. What about the historical facts of the life of Jesus? Paul bears himself, but little like a disciple who has received the doctrines and the principles which he preaches from the master whose name he bears. So Paul acts completely as if he never met this person. Well, he never did. And he actually never teaches anything Jesus teaches. That's just a remarkable fact of life. And this is how he puts it in greater context. So he's talking about the natural starting point of each party is found in the life and work of the founder. So each party has to be measured. Each party of Christianity has to be measured by how close you are far apart from the life of the founder of the Christianity. If you're going to say I'm a Christian or I'm following Christ, then we have a right to judge you based on how close and proximate you are to the Christ of earth or not. And then when you look at it that way, Bauer's saying that's a perfect starting point to do this analysis. And then he comes out saying, no, they're not the same religions, basically. The only question comes to be how the Apostle Paul appears. I just wanted to show you it's all here, the same quote over here. He seldom appeals to any traditions on the subject, though his apostolic activity, as well as that of the other apostles, would have been meaningless without them. Do you see? I think you have to pay attention there. If Jesus hadn't lived, if he hadn't had his messages, wouldn't the message be meaningless? It'd just be like it's like a mystery religion, believing the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. You have some gnosis and you're going to be saved. That's what it looks like if you didn't have the life of Christ. If you didn't have the Gospels, then just look at Paul alone and you go, this is a mystery religion he's teaching. Do you believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus? You believe in 3 facts about this person, and then you're going to heaven. You shall be saved. 1 Corinthians 15:1-4. And then this very insightful comment. He bears himself but little like a disciple who has received the doctrines and principles which he preaches from the master whose name he bears. He means he acts nothing like an apostle who's received any of these messages. He's going to go on and show you that this actually is what Paul boasts. He doesn't want to know anything about the Jesus of earth. And you go, that can't be. It's in the book of Galatians, my friends. Now, here is where I had to extract these quotes so that you could see the passages he's talking about. So I put them over here. For I did not receive, Paul says in Galatians, I did not receive it. What? My gospel from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. Galatians 1:12. So Jesus is ascended in Acts chapter 1. Paul says he has a Damascus Road experience in Acts 9. So in that time period, 3 or 4 years from the ascension of Jesus have already passed when Paul says he's had this experience. And then he boasts in this first epistle, his very first epistle is Galatians in about 50 AD. And he says, I didn't get anything from them, the 12. I got it all from my revelation in heaven, in a vision from Jesus. All my messages. That's where I'm getting it from. Verse 6 in chapter 2. But of these who seem to be somewhat, that is the apostles, those of repute, and he referred to Peter, James, and John, Apostle John, in verses 2, 6, and 9. Whatsoever they were, it makes no matter to me. God accepts no man's person, for they who seem to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. They added nothing to me. Paul is saying, everything I got is from these revelations. The apostles, I met them briefly, but it means nothing to me. God doesn't care about people's credentials. I am my own credential. I went to the third heaven. I had visions. I can't tell you what they were. Can't quote any of them. He says that in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 7. But that's where I got them. And don't need these guys. I don't need the pillars of the church at all. That's in page 50 as well. Now let's continue here. Now this is page 50 again. The great facts of the death and resurrection of Jesus make it what it is. Around these facts, his whole Christian consciousness revolves. His whole Christian consciousness is transformed into a view of the person of Jesus, who stands in need of no history to elucidate it. He's talking about Paul, by the way, that his consciousness has to be aware of all this, supposedly. But it's the consciousness of a Jesus he's only known through revelations and not through direct communication with the 12. Why should he go to eyewitnesses and ear witnesses of Christ's life to ask what he was according to the flesh when he has seen himself in the spirit? Period. Pause. So what he's saying is, Paul is saying, since I got my revelations from Jesus from heaven after his ascension, I don't need these other guys, the 12, to tell me anything. I don't need eyewitnesses. I got the best. I've seen in a vision in my dreams this man when I talk to him and he tells me doctrines, and that's how I've learned how to be a teacher. Then he continues, Baur. Why should he ask whether what he is teaching agrees with the original teachings of Jesus and with the discourses and sayings which have been handed down from him, when in the Christ who lives and works in him, he hears the voice of the Lord himself? Pause. These are all questions Baur's asking, not really. He's trying to give you what Paul's thinking. I don't need to ask them anything. What else explains why he doesn't want to get anything from them? Because his revelations are superior to their revelation. So the fact that they met Jesus, they talked to Jesus, and they spent over a year with him, learning his lessons, writing down things he said, that's inferior to somebody who's claiming I'm getting it all from visions in the heavens. All which again, to repeat, 2 Corinthians 12, verse 7 says what? It's illicit for me to quote it. I can't repeat anything it says, and it's unintelligible. So even if I could repeat it, I don't know what it means. I mean, that's what it sounds like. Unintelligible means you can't understand it, right? So that's the quandary of Paul. How can this person have redefined Christianity in such a way that it's somebody who recklessly doesn't care that it doesn't match the person of Christ who spoke on earth? Again, let's continue. Why should he ask whether what he is teaching agrees with the original teachings of Jesus and with the discourses and sayings which have been handed down from him, when in the Christ who lives and works in him, he hears the voice of the Lord himself? Question mark. Why should he draw from the past what the Christ who is present in him has made to be the direct utterances of his own consciousness? So again, Baur is saying, he's giving you the ideas that Paul must be asking the question, why do I have to draw myself any picture about what Christ taught on earth? I don't need that. That's irrelevant to me. I just need to have these visions or revelations that are coming in my head, and I just have to repeat those without quoting it. I'm not allowed to quote it, but I will just repeat what I'm hearing and just teach that. And that we're supposed to believe is from Jesus. So I'm just going to play devil's advocate here a little bit for a second. Is so when Paul says the law was not given by God, was given by angels through a mediator, and then he goes on from Galatians 3:19 where he says that, and then in Galatians 4:9 he says, why did they want to be in bondage again to the weak and beggarly elements, which Vincent says means celestial beings? That means Paul has denigrated the law given Moses is not given by God, but given by angels. So that's where you end up. You end up having to hear someone who says something completely contrary to Jesus, which Jesus clearly says God, Yahweh gave the law, but Paul says no, it was given by angels. So you have directly contradictory statements in the New Testament. And so how do we resolve that? And this is what he's saying, how Paul viewed his message was superior because he didn't need anything from the 12 because he was getting it direct from Jesus in heaven, supposedly. This is footnote 2 at the end of that paragraph. Nothing could be more paltry than the attempts some scholars have made to fill up the supposed gap in the evidence of the apostles' legitimation. Now, notice he's calling what all those questions prove a gap in the evidence of the apostle Paul's legitimation, meaning he's deficient in being legitimate because he doesn't know anything about Jesus of the earth. Let's continue. It is also asserted that the confidence the apostle expresses that he had not run in vain must mean that he had an accurate acquaintance with the teachings of the historical Christ. Otherwise, it is said he must have been proclaiming himself as a second and better Christ. Okay. And then what Baur says is that if Paul really needed these credentials of having not known Jesus' words and read the Gospel of Matthew or whatever, he would have said so. But since he doesn't say so, Paul, doesn't believe that's important. So this is how he puts that. The attempt to make out quotations is very defective, meaning trying to find some nuggets of Jesus quoted somewhere in Paul, and unsatisfactory, and it is impossible to help thinking that had the apostle himself felt the need of such credentials for his teaching, he would have expressed himself quite differently in his epistles, period. So if Paul really thought he was teaching the same messages with the 12 apostles, he could have used words that would make that clear, but he isn't. He's not trying to. He's not claiming he's relying on anything Jesus said on earth. Continuing, nor would it be easy to understand on such a hypothesis how, at the very time at which it must have been his chief concern to gain as accurately as possible a knowledge of the teaching of Christ, he could maintain an attitude of such an indifference towards the older apostles, period. So what he's saying there is, Paul says, I didn't get anything from the 12 apostles. So if it was, as these people claim, that Paul is really somewhere deep in his lessons actually quoting something Jesus said in some gospel, then why is he saying I did everything I could not to receive any message from the 12 because I was having superior messages from my revelations from Jesus? So Baur is absolutely tearing apart this idea that somehow Paul is somehow basing anything he's teaching from anything he heard Jesus actually taught by second hand or third hand or whatever. Continuing, the teaching of Jesus was to be found nearest its source with them, and if he wished to have the best and most trustworthy information on the subject, he should have frequented their company. However, now Galatians 1:11 shows us distinctly that he recognized no obligation to the older apostles with regard to his gospel. So I think we've already covered that. He says in 1:12, for I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ, Galatians 1:12. So he's definitely on target. 1:11 et sequitur shows us distinctly that he recognized no obligation to the older apostles with regard to his gospel. Baur is right on. Continuing, he would have regarded their communications as a purely human medium and could not have brought them into connection with the immediate gospel of Jesus, which have taken place in his own consciousness. From this, we cannot but conclude that we should have a totally false notion of what his apostolic consciousness was if we suppose that he reached it by the process on which our own historical information is dependent, meaning we use the gospels. Page 58. Thus the apostle, meaning Paul, has placed the law and the promise in such direct opposition to each other that he is obliged to ask what the law is, what purpose it serves, when, owing to its want of power to give life, righteousness could not come by it. The answer which he gives to this question is that the law was interposed between the promise and the time when faith should come because of transgressions, not to prevent them, but that in them sin might attain to its full manifestation reality. Pause. He's talking about the book of Galatians, and he's telling us where Paul in chapter 3 basically says the law was given by angels. Leading up to that, he calls the law a tutor, and it's guiding us. But there's coming a time, and now is the time when we will be adults and we don't need the law anymore, and we just live by the Spirit. Continuing here. This was the interval of the schoolmastership of the law, when mankind, being concluded under sin, was to be detained in ward till it had become a full age, being set free from the law to receive the sonship of God through faith in Christ. And this next panel from page 58 is absolutely extraordinary. Thus, Judaism is nothing more. This is just telling you, summarizing Galatians 3 and 4. Thus, Judaism is nothing more than the religion of the law in contradistinction to Christianity, which is a religion of the Spirit. Both its position in the world and its inner constitution declare that the function of Judaism is that of effecting a transition, of filling up an interval. Pause. Now, of course, the law said it was a law eternal for all generations. Nothing about it was temporary. Nothing about it was temporary in the sense of being an interval to something else. Let's continue. And then the Torah is the cornerstone of a new covenant. Jeremiah 31:31 is the promise of a new covenant. What was that? I'm going to send a new covenant where my Torah will be put on your hearts. Was the Torah taken away from our hearts, taken out of the book? No, it was going to be put more proximately on your heart. And that was by the prophet, Jesus, who taught parables, which basically taught you the law in easily remembered pictures. Let's continue after the word interval. The object it is there to serve is to exercise the stern severity of a watcher. The object of the law is to serve, to exercise stern severity of a watcher set to mark transgressions. He's summarizing Galatians again. And to keep that promise and the fulfillment apart till the period which God has fixed for this event, meaning the fulfillment event, in the order of the world arrive in the fullness of time, and the promise reach its fulfillment. Nay, the apostle places Judaism even lower. Okay, so then that's where the law was aiming. Now, what happened to Judaism? The people who follow the law, or were God's people. Not only does it make men liable to the yoke of the law, like paganism, it has its religious institutions and forms of worship, which are bound to particular times, to days and months and years. In Galatians, Paul is telling the Galatians, why are you being so foolish? You want to keep the Shabbat again? You want to keep days, seasons, and times, months and years, the moons, the new moons. So this is definitely, Baur has it absolutely correct. He's reading Galatians correctly. Thus, it makes man dependent. The law makes man dependent on the same elemental and material nature powers, the adoration of which is characteristic of pagan religion. Pause. And I've showed you this earlier in other episodes where we're reading Galatians 3:19. What's the purpose of the law? What does it serve? It was added because of transgressions till the seed should come. That's Jesus, he claims, should come to whom the promise was made, and it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. Nope. The law said it was given by God, but the Pharisees and Paul all agree that the law was given by angels. And if you see that anywhere, just remember it's a false statement because it contradicts Exodus 20, where you see the laws given at Sinai from Yahweh, repeated 4 times within the 10 Commandments itself. Let's continue. Galatians 4:9, Paul says, and this is what Baur is alluding to. Galatians 4:9, Paul says, but now after you have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn you again to the weak and beggarly? And the correct translation is celestial beings. You notice how he said the same elemental material nature powers. That is a paraphrase of this because he knows the word elements and it does not mean that translation is not correct in Greek. It means celestial beings if you know the context of how this term is used in Greek philosophy and in literature. And that's what, if you want to check that out, go do a Google search on studylight.org. Just type that in first, and then type in Vincent, and then type in Galatians 4. And it'll give you a commentary of Vincent on Galatians 4 where he explains that very point. Okay, so let's go back. So I just want to show you, he's saying that when we get to this point, Paul, has reduced Judaism to not just a temporary tutor. It's now lower. Its observance of Shabbat and all these holidays, it's lower. It's pagan. It's lower. It's you're subjecting yourself, you're being in bondage to the weak and celestial beings, the angels who gave that Torah at Sinai to a mediator named Moses. Do you see, my friends? This is blaspheming God's word. It's denigrating it, so you don't want to get near it. It's not even. It doesn't bring you any blessings. It brings you only curses, and it only brings you death and damnation, because you can't keep these Shabbats, and you can't keep these. I mean, Shabbat, take a day off. That's so hard, according to Paul, to take a day off. But you see, he's part of the cults that don't want you to follow any of the Jewish law, and it has to all go away. So he's just totally erasing it all. But I want you to see Baur's getting it completely right. And on this side, at least stands and on this side, he's paraphrasing Paul again, at least stands on no higher stage of religious development than paganism does. So in other words, Judaism is no better than paganism, Paul has made. So if you're in bondage to paganism, you're in bondage to the law, and you're just equally foolish, oh you Galatians, for wanting to observe Sabbath days, seasons, months, and holidays. That's it. I want to just go back to the beginning here before I let you all go. Is we've only taken up about 17 minutes. Baur was trying to say, if you look at things historically speaking, okay, you see there's a Jewish Christianity and you see there's a Gentile Christianity. And the religion we exist in today is an illicit synthesis. Not that he's saying it's a good thing. Obviously the only true thing has to be what was first, and that has to be what he's calling here Jewish Christianity, or Petrine Christianity, and that meant the 12 apostles. And whoever this guy comes along, he's saying, isn't it? He's implying, he's by just summarizing Paul, not attacking him, just letting you hear what he's saying, but with words that you can equate what it's saying, so that you can interpret what Paul is actually saying. He's saying that Paul's brought something so radically different, it has nothing in common with Judaism. In fact, it denigrates the faith of Jesus. The faith that Jesus had in the law and the Torah, and all of that is a pagan system. So Paul could not have known at all that Jesus Christ taught the law and the Torah. He was totally living in a different world. Why was he completely pagan? Paul was. And Baur was the first one to point this out, although he didn't exactly point the arrows the way I am. He's just telling you what the verses, what he decided to do is he's just going to tell you what the verses mean, what their context is, and he doesn't hesitate to draw a contrast between what you can see of what he calls Jewish Christianity, basically Jesus. He basically is calling Jesus's message Jewish Christianity, to make it a little more compartmentalized so people can understand it. But I would say it's the Jesus movement versus the Paul version of Jesus, which has nothing in common, no doctrines in common, nothing, just words. It's just Paul uses the word Christ like Peter would have used, and so on. So that we have only in common one thing, the name of the word Christ. But other than that, they're totally two different religions. And that's what Baur, for the first time in 1853, exposed. I'm going to digress here for a second. Now, in the prior episode, I discussed with you the message of hi everyone. One, two, three. I just want to turn back one episode in our series of famous quotes about Paul to episode 18, where we discussed Josephus. And basically, Josephus tells us of a person who matches Paul to a T, called Saul. And of course, Paul's preliminary name used in the book of Acts up to chapter 13 is Saul. You can see that in Acts 13:1. And then, for no reason explained, it starts in Acts 16 to call him Paul. So this Saul and Herod Antipas are working together in cahoots as a cooperative unit in fighting against different political issues. And Paul, or Saul at that time, was using violence to help the Herodian family to do that, and also acting as ambassador. So we covered that in the prior episode, and you can see this if you go to the Antiquities of the Jews 20.9.4, and I would say go look at 5 as well, and War of the Jews 2.17.3, and I'd say go look at 4 as well. So this is a clear indication that there is some connection between Paul and the Herodians. And that, if Baur was alive today, I think now reading and having this information late, I would say he would conclude what best explains why Paul thinks he's going to get away with just making up something completely out of the sky, totally fabricated. Just assume that's what it's really about. It was never even, there's no road to Damascus event. None of that's true. Just follow me on this. Just go with it for a moment. Just suspend your disbelief of what I'm saying. But when you read Baur and you see these two disparate viewpoints, one is the Petrine or the Peter, what I would call the Jesus words only movement, and then there's the Paul movement, which is and Saul movement, which is just someone who's saying, everything I get, all my verification is something that nobody else can know and verify or disprove, because I'm telling you, I've heard this in the third heaven, but I'm not even allowed to quote it. I'm not allowed to tell you what I've heard. That's in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 3-6. I can't tell you what it said, but I was in the third heaven and it happened to me. And I heard things that are unspeakable, and they're also illicit if I even could speak about them. So I can't tell you. They're illegal for me to say. It's illegal for anyone to say what they hear in the third heaven. And by the way, what prophet has ever been restricted? I went to a place and God spoke to me, but I can't tell you what he said. So it should be preposterous to us if we use common sense. But just if you didn't use common sense and just said, what are we looking at? Two completely different religions. And what Baur says is they became synthesized. Well, what that really means is they became the true Christianity. Jesus became corrupted by the Roman success later of propaganda. Now, that did not happen, in my opinion, until the 300s when Constantine turned around, because Paul disappears from all written history between about 75 to 180 AD. Nobody's quoting him. They may mention him, but they don't quote anything he says, and that means he's a nobody. And the only people quoting Paul at that time are the Marcionites, which is a completely heretical group claiming Paul is the only true apostle and God Yahweh is the evil God, and he's going to hell, Sheol, with his people Israel. But the Christians are all going to go to heaven with a God who forgives everything and no sin. There's no such thing as sin anymore. We're all going to heaven as long as you give homage to Jesus. Okay. I mean, it does sound a lot like what we have today, but it was very much more extreme. And there's actually three gods: God Yahweh, the dead, God of the dead, God Yahweh, and then there's the good God, the Father, and then there's Jesus. He's also God. So it's not the Trinity that you would think of. So it's a totally different religion and was a heresy, and everybody agreed on that. But really, what I'm saying is there is a complete division between the Jesus words only movement and the Paul movement, the Pauline Christianity, and this is what Baur understood immediately in studying it carefully and very detailed. And then it became syncretized, which means one gave in to the other, and it didn't go in favor of Judaism. It was we were dragged into paganism. All right, now I'm going to tie together Josephus to Baur through this statement here on page 382 of James, the Brother of Jesus, The Key to Unlocking the Secrets of Early Christianity and the Dead Sea Scrolls by Robert Eisenman. And this is what he says. The proposition and the popularity of the Pharisees has been a leitmotif, a common statement of later historical writing, after the Pharisees finally did seize power with the Herodians and the help of Roman troops. Pause. So what he's saying, it wasn't really true originally, but by the time the Herodians came in, that's when the Pharisees became, I don't want to say popular, became authorities that the people had to respect. And they had these beliefs. The law was given by angels, and basically the only Torah that's really authoritative is the oral Torah, which of course is stuff they make up. But the written Torah that was given by angels, not very important. So our oral Torah trumps written Torah. Jesus refuted that in Matthew 15:6, but that's a different story. Let's keep going here. And this popularity of the Pharisees continued. He said, after the destruction of the temple too, when together with Pauline Christians, they were the only Jews the Romans were willing to live with. Okay, so this may explain certain doctrines that arose in Talmudic doctrines. I don't know. People could go research that. But the bottom line is only Pauline Christians were tolerable to the Roman Empire. So they would basically be pushing out over time the Judaic Christians, the Jewish Christians. Then it says here, in the guise of this later rabbinic adumbration, meaning the shadow that could be cast by claiming you're a rabbi, people be intimidated. Oh, well, the Pharisees are now claiming they're also rabbis. Are they really the part of the official rabbis like Gamaliel? Or were they just calling themselves Pharisees? Pharisees were just calling themselves rabbis in a self-appointed way. I think it was the self-appointed way, because rabbi Pharisee is not even a word in the Torah. It is simply a group of people made up about their name, and that's all they are. They have no official status in the Torah. So no wonder they have to believe there's an oral Torah, but I digress. In the guise of this later rabbinic adumbration, they consistently followed a pro-Roman orientation, meaning the Pharisees, even after the Herodians themselves had long gone the way of all flesh. All right, so I basically think that explains exactly where Baur was going. He didn't yet, as far as I've read so far, he's not said the Pharisees were and Paul was fulfilling the mission of the Herodians and the Pharisees simultaneously by making up this second religion, calling it just having something in common, the name of Christ. And in light of that, I want to play for you a single video clip. I saw this today, and this gentleman is trying to tell you if somebody shows you a dollar bill, it's paper money, written by a cartoonist. Does that prove it's really paper money? I think it's very witty, and then I'll just sign off with that. All right, God bless. Take care. Bye.
Let me show you something. This is a legit $1 note. How do you know that it's real? Well, because it says so here, right? $1. So you can rest assured that this is a genuine $1 note. It's not because somebody assumes an identity or uses a certain name that they are the real thing. This is an authentic $1 note. It doesn't only say $1, but it has all the characteristics. And then we have to look if we can see those characteristics. That's how we determine if something is real. You can't just go around and say, look, this is real because it says so.
So if we look at Jesus' warning about false prophets who claim they're sheep, claim they're Christians, but they're really wolves, who could that be about? Just I want you to hear it again, Matthew 7:15. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravening wolves, Matthew 7:15. I want you to hold it right there for just a second. Listen to what the Torah says in Genesis 49:27. And let me just set this up a little bit before I quote it. Is in Genesis 49, Jacob is dying and he has his 12 children. Jacob is also known as Israel. His name was changed to Israel by God also. And he's talking to each of the children. One of them is from Judah. That's the tribe from which Jesus descends through the line of David, is that Judah. And then you would have the other 11 being described, and the Benjamites have their description. It's a negative one in Genesis 49:27, but the one in Genesis 49:10 is about Judah, and that's very positive. It says the scepter will be with this tribe, Judah, over the others, and that would be fulfillment of the kingship of Christ, right? But it also says what will mark this king that's to come is he will have the blood of grapes draped all over his garments. Who could that be? Now, why aren't you ever told about that? Well, because you might stumble across this one. They don't want you to see this. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. 49:27. So first of all, notice that Jesus says the ravening wolf will come in sheep's clothing. So a Benjamite who is a ravening wolf in sheep's clothing sounds very much like only one person we know. That's Paul, right? In the morning, he shall devour his prey. What does Paul do in the beginning of his career? He kills Christians. What does he do in the second part? At night, he shall divide the spoil. Well, what does that mean? Spoil is illicit gains you shouldn't have gotten yourself. Well, Paul says, no one would commend me. No one would give me letters of commendation. So he wasn't authorized, just so you know, to go after the Gentiles. See, that was not permitted by the 12, just so you know, because he's objecting multiple times. He says, even though I haven't gotten these commendations to speak to you, thank you for listening to me. I mean, literally, he mentions this, and I'm going to do a video on the commendation letter issue later. But anyway, but regardless, he also divides the church in two. We now have warring factions. If you're a Jewish Christian, you've now gone from being the leaders and the people who are holding the message of Jesus, and now you're told this message of Jesus is defunct. It's a different dispensation by these Gentiles all around you. And if you try to tell people to obey Shabbat, which is important under Isaiah 56, you're called a Judaizer. And in Rome, in the 300s, this was also called a crime. Judaizing became a statutory crime, borrowing a word only Paul made up, and took that word of Paul, made it a crime to be a Judaizer. You want to obey Shabbat, you're going to be executed, or you're going to be all your property is going to be taken, or you can't inherit. They have multiple different penalties for you they can choose from, and this became a crime that went on for millennia through the Justinian kingdom of Byzantium. But I digress. Anyway, so this fits Paul to a T, and even the early church, just so you know, thought this was about Paul. All of them. Oh, but Doug, then why did they accept him? Oh, because they were looking at the Septuagint mistranslation of this, and instead of spoil, it said food. They divide divide the food. And Tertullian said, even though I've written a whole book here and against Marcion in 207 AD, he writes a book saying Paul is a false apostle. He's not truly apostle. He can't be. There's only 12. He says the whole thing, ladies and gentlemen, to refute Marcionism. But then he says, I have to just say this. The very end, he says, I still have to think Paul has some validity in some way, because it says there in Genesis 49:27, he will give me food. That's it. That's all the reason that Paul hung on a translation error of Septuagint, and that's the reason he was kept at all in Tertullian's mind, is having any validity whatsoever. And then after that time, the Roman Catholics were smart enough to let's not say Paul fulfilled any prophecy in the Old Testament. We're only going to get in trouble. We're only going to point an arrow at him. So let's stop doing that. And you've never heard it again. You never hear it. And that's why you don't hear about the prophecy of Jesus that's so obvious in Genesis 49 verses 10 to 14. And I have a whole episode on that where I go all through those 4 verses and show you on multiple criteria, not just the grapes, splattered grapes criteria, but all of them, that it all fits Jesus. It's a prophecy. And the prophecy of Jacob was that this sons that they're talking about would be in the latter days. So when the latter days come up, Judah is going to have a scepter in his hand, but he's going to have the blood of grapes on him. And in the latter days will be this Benjamite ravening wolf, whom Jesus again correlates perfectly with this. Beware the false prophets. Does Paul claim to be a prophet? Absolutely. Who come to you in sheep's clothing? Does he claim to be a Christian? Yes. But inwardly are ravening wolves. Is Paul a ravening wolf? Well, he definitely is, if he's fulfilling the prophecy of Genesis 49:27. And you can see the way it describes him there. Describes him. He is ravenous wolf in the morning. He's killing Christians. That definitely fits a ravening wolf. All right. God bless everybody. Take care. Ciao. Bye.